You focus on the gender health gap. Tell us what the gender health gap is.
It's the systemic disparities in how women and men experience healthcare. Right now, women and men are not receiving the same level of both access to, but also quality of healthcare. And there's a myriad of reasons for that. Women were not part of clinical trials, so that means that we have a very adverse effect to medicine compared to men.
Femtech, what is that? Is it just period tracking apps?
There's a lot of misconceptions about femtech. Usually people will think it's technology created by women, and I'm like, no, that's just technology created by women. Femtech is technology that serves women's health and well-being, so it's obviously very broad and a lot more than just reproductive health. It's a lot more than maternal health and period tracking and those things, even if those are a very big part of women's health. Women are 80% of the ones that are suffering from autoimmune disease. Why are women suffering from that more than men? Or why are women suffering more from Alzheimer's than men?
Hello and welcome to the Investing in Other Stories podcast. I'm your host, Margarita Tr, a former Wall Street executive, an angel investor, and founder of Finance Latte, a leading investing education company. I founded this podcast to fill what I was missing in the finance industry, a place for top women investors to share insights directly with individual investors. It doesn't matter if you've been investing in stocks, funds, or startups for years, or you're just getting started. This podcast is for you. The content provided on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be considered investment advice. Please stay tuned at the end of this episode for more important disclosures. I'm so excited about today's episode because we have a fabulous guest from a venture studio. You might be unfamiliar with this term. It has some similarities with venture capital, but in my honest opinion, venture studios are a lot more fascinating. We'll learn more about it together on this episode with our guest, Malin Frithiofsson, CEO of Daya Ventures, the world's first femtech venture studio. At Daya, Malin leads the creation of startups and addresses critical gaps in women's health, blending proven technology with a deep understanding of market needs. Her work aims to redefine how innovation and entrepreneurship can drive meaningful change in a sector often overlooked by traditional investors. As an angel investor, Malin focuses on early-stage impact tech companies, supporting transformative solutions that align with her vision for a more equitable future. Her expertise lies at the intersection of technology, investment, and social impact, making her a key voice in the femtech space. Malin, what an impact maker you are. I'm so glad you're here, and a warm welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. You never get used to hearing someone introduce yourself. You're like, who's that cool woman? It's a great way to start the day.
I attest to that. You are one of the coolest person I know. I'm so excited for everybody else to meet you. So let's get started. So you have such a fascinating journey from your degree in gender studies to startups and then femtech. How did the tech part of femtech come into your career journey?
So I think the first part of my career journey was obviously gender. So in university, I studied gender studies. I thought that I would work politically. My goal has always been to improve the lives of women. Then I just fell into the VC side of it. To be fair, it was pretty much that the first kind of VC I worked at, Chalmers Ventures, is in the same building as the gender studies major where we have our classes. So it was serendipitous in that way. And I had always worked with building up quite large nonprofit organizations, which apparently was quite entrepreneurial. So I got a job there and I learned the power of entrepreneurship in pushing societal impact. Out of this was a VC that worked with commercializing of research. So obviously then the technology aspect came in of it. And I was privy to seeing, okay, if you put technology, capital, and entrepreneurship together, those are three kind of very big instruments for pushing progress very quickly. I fell in love with that because I always thought that I would take like a political route because I thought that was the way to change society through politics. That was my view of the world, but that is so slow. Like I was involved in politics when I was young, loved it, but it's so slow. Those processes are compared to when it comes to technical innovation, entrepreneurship, they're supposed to be slow. And in some cases, maybe even the tech and entrepreneurship development should be slower when it comes to pushing impact. But that's another kind of question around things. But that's how I fell in love with those as tools for change. And then I still always had my core goal, which has always been to improve the lives of women. So they naturally floated together. I started working with women in tech. And then I started realizing that I wanted to have this be part more of my working every day, like the 8 hours I spend at work every day. I want them to really have the impact that I'm looking to have. So I quit my job. I was then working at Startup Norway. I quit that job and started working with what we do at Daya full time, which is basically connecting tech entrepreneurship to create the future that we want to see. So I see it as political action in the form of a venture studio.
Fantastic. That's so interesting. And there's many elements to that we're going to dive into. I'm trying to pace myself.
I love talking about what we do. It's like my favorite thing ever. I'm having a field day here.
Wonderful. So I want to talk about the gender health gap because for me, I'm an investing educator for women and I'm trying to close the gender investing gap, which leads to the wealth gap, meaning, for example, women in Sweden own only 50% of all the wealth men do. But you focus on the gender health gap. Tell us a little bit more about what the gender health gap is.
Yeah, so the gender health gap, it's the systemic disparities in how women and men experience healthcare. Right now, women and men are not receiving the same level of both access to, but also quality of healthcare. And there's a myriad of reasons for that. You can take that women were excluded from drug trials as late as up till the 1990s. We're still suffering the consequences of that. But it's also that women's health is under-researched, underfunded. We can talk about the different reasons, or we can talk about the different consequences. And the reasons, it's a myriad of them, but the consequences are very kind of concrete. Women were not part of clinical trials. So that means that we have a very adverse effect to medicine compared to men. I think one of the most kind of glaring examples is for your American listeners, you have Ambien, which is a quite kind of common drug in the US. And it was 20 years after it was released, FDA had to go out and decrease the dosage recommendations for women because it had such adverse effects. Only been in market for 20 years it took to realize that, okay, the same dosages that we were saying didn't work because we had actually not tested it. And it is statistically proven that women have more adverse effects to drugs than men. But then there's the other half of kind of the opportunity loss that we won't know. We won't know which drugs maybe would have worked for women, but they weren't tested. They were tested on men, didn't work, and then the clinical trial was thrown out. There's been some kind of where you backtrack now and reinvestigated and realized, okay, but this actually worked for women that you dismissed as a failed trial.
This is just blowing my mind, I have to say.
It is mind-blowing. And I've seen it in the startup world as well. Quite early on in my career, I had started, I was doing a clinical trial and they only had men as part of it. And I asked why, and they said that it's a lot harder and more expensive to do it with women because both there's a lot of more kind of disqualifying factors for women to be part of a trial, but also you have to take their hormone fluctuations into the variety. So it's really hard to get a clear result. And I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But you are aware that the results are not going to be applicable for half of the world's population. And he's like, that's actually true. And I was like, you're one of the smartest people I know. You did not consider this quite simple kind of cause and effect.
Just think about the economics. If you want to forget everything else, at least the economics, you would think that people would at least think of that. The very least.
There's an organization called Women's Healthcare Access Matters, and they did a report in 2021. And I think it was like if you spend $13 million on a few specific instances within women's health, you would get $300 million back. So that's a 43x ROI. So in just longer time spent working, less, visits to hospitals and things. There's definitely a financial case for it as well. Women are more likely to be misdiagnosed when having a heart attack, which is the number one killer for women. It's usually talked about like cardiovascular disease is like a man's disease, but it's the number one killer of women. For endometriosis and these types of condition, the best case scenarios in these studies was there was 3 years until you get a diagnosis. The more common one was 7 years until you get a diagnosis. So obviously we could talk about the gender health gap. We could have like 5 episodes just talking about that and the consequences that it has. On a personal level, I've had preeclampsia twice. It still kills 500,000 women every year. We have no idea why we get it. Like we have some theories, but we don't know why women get it. And we have no cure except for inducing labor and taking the baby out. So there's a lot of things where, that's where my frustration came from because I also angel invested, and when I was working at a VC, and you kept seeing pitches for problems that I didn't feel were that big problems, or I already felt they were solved, and this is just making the solution a little bit better. And then we have this whole kind of big open field of half of the world's population's health and well-being that is just being so underserved. So it just kept getting frustrating to me. Why are we spending so much money? But also the real rare kind of currency is the entrepreneurs. Why are we spending so many smart entrepreneurs doing digital accounting when we haven't solved these kind of important things? So that's the Daya was born out of that frustration. We need to put people on solving the real issues instead.
Exactly. And it's deeply personal. As you said, you have direct experience, but even if not, it's in front of us, even if we have not directly experienced it.
Most of us are going to have a period. Most of us are going to have children. All of us are going to have menopause. Unfortunately, if nothing, knock on wood, maybe something happens so we can stop it. I don't know if we would even want to. So it really is all women. It really is like a core part of the lived experience of women getting around it.
Great. So we've touched already on femtech. And no, it's not fintech. We're not talking about fintech. Every time I tell somebody, they think I say fintech. So femtech, what is that? Is it just period tracking apps? Yes, of course, Clue and Flow and other such apps were one of the first ones to be called femtech. But what else is there that's classified as such?
There's a lot of misconceptions about femtech. Usually people will think it's technology created by women. And I'm like, no, that's just technology created by women. Femtech is technology that serves women's health and well-being. So it's obviously very broad. And women's health and being is a lot more than just reproductive health. It's a lot more than maternal health and period tracking and those things, even if those are a very big part of women's health. Women are 80% of the ones that are suffering from autoimmune disease. Why are women suffering from that more than men? Or why are women suffering more from Alzheimer's than men? So there's a lot of issues, osteoporosis, and a lot more than has to do with our reproductive functions that is huge effects on health and well-being. And at Daya, we've actually launched vertical that we really hope that the industry will adapt as well, which is contextual femtech. So in the traditional sense, there's physiological femtech, which is anything to do with the health of the female body. So not just reproductive functions, but everything that is connected to the women, the biological body. And then we have contextual femtech, which is anything that is a threat to women's health and being from the context of the world today. And why we landed on the need for that type of vertical was because I will get into more later what we do at Daya, but we do interventions on different areas. We did one on pregnancy and birth, and we dig really into the issue. And if you just look at it from the physiological femtech side, you're missing out on the number one cause of death for women, pregnant women in America. The number one cause of death for pregnant women in America is domestic violence. So how can we say that we are working to actively solve and create better maternal outcomes if we have a scope that is too narrow to address the number one cause of death? So obviously, as a woman in the world today, there are a lot more threats to our health and our lives and our well-being that are not connected to our physical body, but the context of the world today. In femtech, we also include domestic violence, equal opportunities, basic equality, and things that are known to have an impact on women's health that are not directed to our physiological kind of body, basically. So femtech is new. It was coined by Ida Tr from Clue in 2016. So it's very young, and it's still, as it is with all types of terms, they are up for negotiation in society. And my argument for that negotiation is that it needs to be very broad and it needs to be experience focused, not, physical body focused only.
Can you give us a couple more examples of contextual femtech to fully grasp the concept?
Yeah, so we actually have a startup that we work with at Daya that uses technology to look at metadata for large organizations and find informal hierarchies. So basically what they do is that, okay, if you just look at a company's organizational structure chart, you're missing the informal hierarchies that might be leading causes for why women are not getting promoted to the same extent as men or not getting salary raises to the same extent as men. And that is our financial health is directly connected to our mental health, for instance. So I think that's a very cool application of technology to really dig into one of the cost stressors for women in the workplace. We also have mental health. Women are more prone. They're the ones that are most on sick leave for burnout and stress-related mental illness. That is not something in our brain and our kind of brain chemistry that makes us more susceptible to that. It's because it's in the context of the world today where women are faced with a lot more stressors and a lot more responsibilities outside of the workplace. So that is also a part of contextual femtech. Yeah, there's a lot to dig into, unfortunately, when it comes to improving the health of being for women across the globe.
Makes total sense. And I bet the unpaid work that women do outside the workplace, it's having one or two additional jobs that, of course, are unpaid. And that can definitely lead to burnout. So I can completely understand.
There was a study now showing just the amount of hours you spend breastfeeding. If you breastfeed the first year after you've given birth, that equates to 2.5 full-time jobs. And most women do that whilst also having a full-time job and also running a household. Yes, I definitely think it's no surprise to me that women are burning out at a higher rate than men.
And is there one area within femtech that Daya is exploring that is more either underserved or more exciting? Pick one of the two.
Oh, there's so many. Like right now, we're doing an intervention on women in space. So I would say that's both underserved and maybe very exciting. It's usually our interventions are very down to earth. That's a funny pun when we're doing it's endometriosis, it's birth experience, it's autoimmune disease. It's very grounded. And this one, we're actually having a lot more explore about it. It's very fun, but it's also for two reasons. One, space travel is going to become a reality soon. If we do the same mistake as we did when discovering this world, we had a lot of colonialism and it was men finding this world. What would it look like if it had been women instead? Are we going to do the same mistake when we're exploring space? But also the same mistake as with clinical trials. We're building things and we think they're going to work the same for male and female bodies. Mm-hmm. There's actually research now with a bunch of mice in space and how female versus male mice react to space travel. It's a lot of interesting thing, but also from just a philosophical approach where a lot of things with femtech is about women's health catching up. We have this disparity in healthcare and we're just trying to get women to the same level of healthcare as men. It's no fun always playing catch up. I think we need also to allow ourselves to be in front of things. So maybe it's not going to be the most kind of applicable intervention we've ever done. But I think it's important also to allow women to be at the forefront of innovation and not just playing catch up to the male level of service, basically. So I'm very keen. I think it's very fun to do the women in space thing. At the same time, we're doing the endometriosis one, which is obviously going to have more impactful results for a lot more women. There's not a lot of women in this generation, in this lifetime, that is going to benefit from our findings in the space exploration. But sometimes you just got to allow yourself to have fun also. So
it does sound incredibly fun. But I love the angle. You shouldn't always be playing catch up. You should be at the forefront as well. Sounds fantastic. All right. The next question, please do not roll your eyes. But I've heard some men characterize femtech as niche. And of course, Q for eye roll here because women are more than half the population. So there are many A types of investors out there. Why don't you just give us some numbers in terms of total addressable market, growth rates, or some more numbers for the A types out there?
This is such a relevant question. I'm going to give you a quote from a founder that I thought was really funny. She'd been out fundraising for a femtech startup. It feels like evangelizing that women exist. Like I have to make the case that women actually do exist. But femtech, it's a huge market. And I feel like now I just want to pull up the numbers in front of me. But one thing that I don't want people to miss out on is that women are really the power users of health tech and new technologies. We're very fast to adopt new consumer apps, new wearables, and women are more likely to pay for health tech apps. Women are the ones making healthcare decisions for the entire family. So if you were a marketing expert trying to make your personas, women are really the power users when it comes to health technologies. Just for that reason, it makes a lot of sense to invest in women. And as it comes to the overall market, it's called a $1 trillion market, and that's what's going to happen in 2030. So last year it was averaged at a $37 billion market, and that has grown from a $5 billion market in 2022. It's growing exponentially. It's fine to say that it's an exploding market, but also a very undercapitalized sector. So for investors, if you're looking at a market that is like exploding when it comes to opportunity and when it comes to consumer demands, both on a macro perspective, but also an individual level, where these women are very like early adopters and high adopters, and also with a proven kind of high willingness to pay for these types of solution. If you add that towards it, it's also being a very undercapitalized. So there's very cheap tickets to get in. It's a dream market for investors. So if we take the woman out of it and the impact out of it and the justice aspects completely out of it, it's just looking at the financials, it's a terrific market. But I think what investors say it's niche, they might be thinking that femtech is only about fertility and reproductive functions. So that's all, but also the majority of half of the world's population will be dealing with reproductive issues. I would say issues because no one's having fun having their period. So I think that's an issue in itself, even if it's completely normal. So if you boil it down to the barest minimum DNA, it's still not a niche market. I'm trying to play devil's advocate and try to help them out. You boil it down. It's really not a niche market at all. But femtech is so much more. It's so much more than the bikini area, would you say? It's more about the breasts and the vagina. Like it's the total health of half of the world's population. I don't understand how you can see that as niche.
Wonderful. So in our prior episode, we had Mala Valroy, a venture capitalist from Industry Funding, and we talked a lot about the venture capital model, the firms writing checks to startup companies. Daya, however, is a venture studio, which is a little bit different. Can you contrast that as a beginning compared to venture capital, and then tell us more about what you do at Daya?
Yeah, this is actually a great opportunity because when I talk about Daya, the first question I think people have is, okay, so you're a fund. And I'm like, no, we're not a fund. So, a fund will have LPs, they will have raised money from other people, and then they will allocate that money and then close the fund, and digging it back into very, very basics. And then they will make a management fee and a carry, like a profit for the success of the fund. We are not that. We are a startup in ourselves. Daya Ventures is a limited company, and we create other companies. They are our product. So we are like a fund in the sense that we're building a portfolio. We have portfolio thinking, but we don't find startups and pay them money for shares in their startup. We build the startups from scratch. So we are the ones who have created them. We're not purchasing shares, we're building companies, basically. And when we make an exit out of a startup, we don't have any LPs to repay. That doesn't go into kind of closing a fund. That's money that goes straight into our balance sheet, like we sold any other type of product. So we are a startup. Our product is other startups. It's a very long sales cycle. It's a very fun production and very profitable when you actually do sell. That is the kind of main difference from a fund. And when we started this, I was not committed to a specific solution. I was committed to Daya has to improve the lives of women through technology and entrepreneurship. Like, how do we do that? And we were looking into, like, should we start a fund? And we were looking at, okay, there are actually quite a decent amount of funds coming up that have their thesis to invest in femtech or female founders. So there actually is some capital in the market, but there wasn't the type of deal flow that we wanted to see. So even if we had a bunch of money, I wouldn't know where to invest it. There are some really great startups, but there's not enough for all of these funds to allocate all of their money. So then we realized, okay, we really need to do is we need to create the deal flow that we would have wanted to invest in. I'm also an angel investor. Every investor probably that's listening, can you close their eyes and imagine, I want this to drop in my inbox, like with this type of founder, this type of business idea, this type of traction. If I just wish I could find that. And you wait for it to come to you, or you're actively, proactively out looking for it, but you're still dependent on someone else having a eureka moment, finding the right team, coming up with a good solution, and then you being able to find them or them being able to find you. I'm quite impatient woman, apparently. So that seemed quite slow to me. And instead of sitting on our hands and hoping for someone else to do it to the point where we could support it, why not just do it ourselves? Which may sound super naive, but isn't that the point of entrepreneurship? You have to believe that anything is possible as long as you kind of put your heart into achieving it. So what we do is that we start with very broad problem statements. Obviously, women in space, very broad. And we have endometriosis, very broad problem statement. Endometriosis exists. It sucks. Things needs to be done about it. And when we do an intervention on an area, we invite stakeholders. So researchers who have published on the subject matter, doctors who have worked with the issue, patient groups that have lived the issue, and any other stakeholders that we feel like, okay, they would have a relevant kind of information and expertise to bring into these discussions if we really want to understand this core problem from both the patient perspective and the clinical perspective. And we always have a tech team in these interventions, so engineers and designers. And the goal is to really understand the problem and then figure out, is there a space for a tech solution to come in where they could mitigate some of the issue, either for the patient perspective or the clinical perspective, or ideally for both? And usually from an intervention, it would be like 5 embryonic ideas that comes out. And an intervention is like a series of workshops with different stakeholders, basically. And we take that into what we call a discovery stage. So we seek validation for the hypothesis that we have surrounding the solution. So usually it's looking into research if there's any kind of evidence that could back that the solution that we think we have would actually have the results that we think it would have. So we have researchers already in the early stage, but they are focused on the problem. So here's more kind of funding research to support our proposed solution. Usually about half of them dies here as well, not because there's like any contradictory evidence. It's more that there isn't any evidence because we're still facing the issue that there's not enough research being done on women's health. We're just a year-old company, so we don't have the muscles to do a bunch of clinical trials. So at this stage, we need to rely on external evidence for our solutions. But half of the idea, so two and a half, it never happens, but 2 or 3 makes it through that stage, and then we do a design sprint. So we build the prototype, usually to technology readiness level 2. We do an IP hypothesis, so we don't apply for any patents, but we want there to be a pathway to patent, or at least a strategy for how to deal with the IP. We do light branding, a logo, a website, a name, those small things that are important for a company to get off the ground. And we source founders. So usually there's founders that have stuck with the idea from the intervention stage. So in some of our interventions, there's been one from the tech team and one of the doctors find each other and follow the proposed ideas, and they stick with it. And then we will source additional founders. As an investor, when I meet with startups, one of the hardest thing is when you really like an idea, but the one pitching, you don't believe in the entrepreneur. Not because they're not like a great person, but it's really hard to execute on startups. And you can't separate that. And that's something that can really lie awake at night. They're like, oh, I really like that idea, but I can't put my money in this because I don't think that they will be able to execute on it. And then a good idea is nothing. So that's ideal in this situation because we can always recruit what we think is the ideal team. So it's the same way where you close your eyes and you dream of the perfect case. You're also the perfect founders, and we actually have the opportunity to recruit that. So we always want someone who understands the core technology, someone who understands the clinical aspect, and someone who has run a startup before. And of course, for them to like each other is the hardest part. Not like each other, but there's this thing with human chemistry that is very hard to foresee and plan around.
This is such an incredible process. First time I heard about it, I was so impressed. And as we all know, like 80% of the startups fail. But before you even start, create an entity and even recruit founders, you've risk mitigated so much, right? You've put all these stakeholders in one room. You worked on finding a problem that can be solved. You even created a draft IP path. You've done so much work to mitigate that risk, right? You are only 1 year into this, but I wouldn't be surprised if the failure rate of the Daya startups is much, much less than anybody else.
We call it that we work with systematically de-risking innovation. What are the kind of 3 big risks that you see in startups? It's market risk, it's tech risk, and people risk. So we try to mitigate the market risk with the intervention. Like we don't just take an idea and then try to validate it, but we will want to have buy-in from the early start from the people who would be using it because they've been part of coming up with the solution with us. And then when it comes to the tech risk, we build a prototype, but we also verify that kind of the main technology is buildable and that it's actually buildable in a financially sustainable way. So we will know that it's doable at least. And if it's not, then we will put it on the back burner and hope for technology development to catch up to our ideas. And then, of course, the team risk. So you're looking at, we actually have some data now not from us because we're so young, but from venture studios that have existed previously. And they have a lot less failure rate. So the failure rate for venture studio startups is lower than 60% because you have all these kind of risk mitigation and you're not born from a vacuum. So we have a completely new kind of different support system. When it comes to go to market, it's really hard for health tech startups to manage regulations, but also finding test beds and getting the buy-in from clinics or hospitals. It's a lot easier for us to have those types of partnerships and provide them for our startups than it is for a single startup to manage to get a foot in the door that way. I really believe in this as a good kind of tool for de-risking innovation, but also specifically within health tech, which femtech ultimately is, because there's so much to be had when it comes to talking about shared infrastructure and pathways to market. it makes so much more sense to not reinvent the wheel for every startup, but actually have a pretty decent foundation for them to build upon from the start.
Wonderful. And you mentioned the venture studio model, that it has been proven that it has less risk. Can you contrast a little bit the Nordic, so to speak, venture studio model, which from my understanding, it's more focused on just a studio providing the tech solution for a company that I think it has had a bit of a bad rep, so to speak, versus the US kind of model, which Daya is more aligned towards.
So the US kind of, or I would say the original kind of term of venture studio is when you co-build the startup, not just someone coming with an idea to you when you build the technology. I think that what we've seen here in the Nordics is a lot of tech consultancies are realizing that, okay, we can expand a lot, but it doesn't really scale. It's still money for hours. Looking to build a portfolio, but you don't have an investment arm. So the way you do it is that you accept pro bono assignments and they pay you in equity, and then you call yourself a venture studio. You can call it Termstar, whatever, but that's not what we do at all. It happens that someone will come to us with an idea, and then if we think it's really good, they validate it on their own, we can skip the intervention stage and go right to discovery and then design sprint. But it's more usually that we will be part of the whole process of coming up with the idea and building kind of the start of the company and then handing it over to the founders than any kind of transactional where it's, okay, you build this prototype, I give you shares, and then we go our separate ways. Less we don't, because you own 30% of my company and I'm never going to be able to raise a Series A because I'm so diluted. Like, it's an issue because there's also translating, okay, this prototype would have cost you $500,000. So that means you should give me 30% of your company, and not understanding that means that the company is never going to be eligible for a Series A round and you're never going to get your money back anyways, because you don't have a understanding of the full capital journey because you are a tech consultancy. You don't work in venture. I don't think that's a very sustainable model, to be fair.
Great. So I want to ask you about how you measure success, right? You have the financial return for your startups, but there's also the impact portion. How do you measure the impact?
That's actually very hard, but we've created our own impact scorecard. We haven't actually launched it yet, but we have a full impact team. So in the first round, we had two amazing angels who are professionals within the impact frameworks who joined us in that round, and they've been working with how do you translate. There's a lot of impact frameworks around when it comes to sustainability and when it comes to climate and things like that, but there isn't really one when it comes to women's health, and in also adding the contextual aspect of it. So we've created a scorecard, basically a tool to measure a product or service impact on women's health that we will be launching as an open source methodology. This is still tricky because there are no kind of industry standards. Anyone can call themselves femtech. I've seen a breast augmentation company call themselves femtech. When we sat down and did the femtech scorecard, I realized during this discussion that a lot of my work is based out of frustration or something. But I was very frustrated because they're like, okay, they can call themselves femtech because they're selling something to women, but most people would know that most things marketed towards women are not good for women's health. I would not say that breast augmentations are necessarily a good thing for women's health. It could actually be a negative impact. Or deodorants for vaginas can also be called femtech. So we created a scorecard that measures a bunch of different segments within a product. Does it contribute to unhealthy beauty standards or things like that? And also economical, financial wealth and financial impact is huge. Our startups are majority owned by women, all of them. They are majority led by women. We have some male co-founders, but I think it's one of our startups. Otherwise, it's all female teams, and just making sure that women have more ownership. Women are half of the world's population, but we do definitely not own half of the world's companies or properties. So you can talk to ownership about that, but they're doing great work. So I will have more to say about exactly how we measure it when we launch the scorecard. We're working on making sure that the whole industry can measure it in a standardized way.
So my next question is about investing in femtech. Can individual investors invest in a venture studio like Daya? Do you need to have a qualification status?
Anyone that we approve of can invest. We're a limited company. In our cap table, we've done one round, and it's a combination between led by a VC and then some angels from our team and from outside, basically. When we were fundraising the first time, one of the main thing I heard was we can invest a fund in a fund. And I was like, well, we're not a fund. But now in second fundraising, and now I'm talking to investors, VCs that are only investing in venture studios. So I think that we're definitely seeing a difference in understanding the venture studio model and how that actually plays into the existing venture capital system rather than contradictory to it. Daya own exit horizon as a company, same as any other startup. And we're actually quite if I can say so myself, and tooting my own horn, I think we're a pretty good kind of case for most investors. It's just that we have the added benefit that the product that we are producing and selling is also something that our investors would be interested in buying. So it's a win-win in that sense.
When you think about the whole femtech ecosystem, is there one type of support that the ecosystem needs, from whether it's an individual investor or institutional investor, and how can people get more involved in the space?
I would say, based on our experience, there should be a lot more support for the venture studio model, because I think we have great support in the Nordics and in Europe for people who want to raise new funds. We have great support for accelerators. Most of them are funded by the government, but we don't really have any support for venture studio model because it just doesn't really fit in. It's not been established way of working with startups before, but I think the innovation ecosystem also have to be open to be innovative. But then when it comes to the femtech startups, I would say that one gap is the very, very early capital. So I think it's a great opportunity for women who are looking to become angels to not be afraid and think that you have to wait until you have $1 million saved up. There's a lot of opportunities for very small ticketed angels to, if you're willing to come in super, super early and be hands-on. And actually, my first angel investment I ever made was 50K Norwegian. I literally invested the kind of the share capital to incorporate. And that has been thus far a 15x return on that one. So I wouldn't say that 50K is a normal ticket for people to have you balance your expectations, but there is a gap for very early stage capital. And I think that's a great kind of combination with hoping to get more women into investing. And if you start early, then it is more risky. But yeah, I can help you find some de-risked. I happen to know a portfolio of de-risked early stage, so So I think that's missing. And then I would love to see more venture studios pop up. I've always said that the way we do it, we've chosen women's health, but I would love for every social development goal to have its own venture studio where you're like action-oriented impact entrepreneurship, where you're like, okay, we're going to solve the issue of homelessness and we're going to do it through this. And we're going to dig into, or with carbon emissions, we're going to have a venture studio only on that and dig into specific areas of that. I think that this model actually works really well compared to waiting for people to have eureka moments, doing it the way the universities are doing, where we have this technology coming out, this research coming out. What can we do with it? Like, where can we apply it? What can we solve with it? Sometimes it happens to be a great match and a great company is created, but it's the wrong way to start. You usually don't start with the technology and then find the problem.
Exactly.
Let's split it and start with the problem, then find the research to attach to it, or then find the technology to attach to it. So I would love for more venture studios with different themes of different verticals, basically.
Makes perfect sense. So let's see what the future holds.
If anyone wants to set one up, let me know. We're not stingy with sharing our learnings from this journey, because I think that if I could clone myself, I would do one more for a venture studio for climate. We have not found that technology yet, or it has not been shared with me. I think maybe Beyonce has a cloning machine. It wouldn't surprise me. It's not available to me yet.
Okay, and let's touch on AI. Is there a company that you've created that is solving, of course, an important issue and is using AI to solve that issue that is growing beyond your expectations?
Yes. I actually have a few examples, but I'll start with the most kind of recent ones. And it was one of the kind of the internal eureka moments when you realize that a problem is so much more bigger than you think it is. So we did an intervention a while back on the birth experience, and we realized that we found one specific area where it just snowballs into you wouldn't believe how big of an impact it has on society as a whole. But if women are afraid of giving birth, which seems like a small issue, I mean, it's not a small issue because everyone should feel safe, but it seems like a small issue at first hand. Women are afraid of giving birth. The consequence of that is we see a direct relation. If you are scared, then you have a longer birth, you have more interventions like a suction cup. And if you have a longer birth, more traumatic birth, then have a bigger risk of postpartum depression. And if you have a bigger risk of postpartum postpartum depression, you have a bigger risk of being on sick leave after your maternal leave, and you have a bigger risk of not coming back to the workplace that you left. So it has actually a big kind of impact. And we also realized that in longer birth and more interventions, you have a bigger risk for the kids getting mineralized teeth, which means they have an easy time getting cavities, which cost society a lot. So there's so many things to dig into. And it for something that seemed like a very trivial, small issue to begin with. And then, looking at solutions for that. And we saw, what is available now for women who are scared of giving birth? And we have this program that's called the Aurora program that you could go, but it's a very few people that actually get a referral there because it's a small program. So it's a lot less than half of those that wanted a remittance that gets accepted to it. And it's only 3 sessions. So it's a very kind of short support. And then you could go to a public therapist, but the waiting time is about 6 months, so that you're probably given birth by then. Like there's a timeline on that. You could pay for it yourself, which is like 1,500 for 45 minutes, and it's also really hard to find one that specializes in tokophobia, like the fear of giving birth.
And the 1,500, that was in kronas, Swedish kronas.
Yeah. Otherwise, it would have been even more depressing. But then we realized, looking into research, is there anything that has been proven to actually have the best effect or have an effect at all on treating anxieties about giving birth? And then it's cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, that makes sense. It's very good at treating phobias. And we have a lot of studies proving that actually works. But hey, there's also studies proving that internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy would actually work. So now we're starting to get onto something like, could we provide a digital version of this to at least make it a little bit more accessible, cheaper, available for more people? And then more research comes out, digging into, you have the tech team in these interventions, you're digging into having people who work with the cognitive behavioral therapy and realizing that cognitive behavioral therapy is actually very modular. So that's actually a form of therapy that would translate quite well to AI. Psychodynamic therapy would not translate well because it's not very modular. It's very hard to predict. But CBT is actually, it's built in a way where the engineers in the room, when they were listening to how it was being explained, they're like, oh, that sounds like you're talking about a decision tree almost. Obviously, it's always better to speak physically to a therapist, but it's not available to everyone. It's expensive. There needs to be an additional step on the ladder of support. And AI could provide that in a way that actually can provide the level of cognitive behavioral therapy and those type of exercises that you would do with a therapist or as homework from a therapist. It could support you in that and actually have an effect on the level of fear you have. And the level of fear will have an effect on your birth outcome and then all the things related to it. So I think that's a perfect example of AI. I would never call it a substitute because when we're talking about your mind, it's always going to be better to speak to a therapist. I'm very much a pro-therapy person, but that is a very class issue right now. And I think that is a way where AI can come in and not do the job of a therapist, but do some of the job of a therapist for the people who either can't afford a therapist or doesn't need to see a therapist and just needs a lighter support and just needs that type for some type of therapy and be one that actually fits quite well.
What is the name of the company?
It's called Glimmer.
Glimmer.
So, yeah, it actually comes from Glimmer. It came from TikTok. So we actually had an intern that was on TikTok. So it's the opposite of a trigger. So a trigger is something that shows up in your feed and gives you anxiety. Whilst a glimmer is something that shows up in your life or your feed that just gives you an instant sense of like a really pretty sunset. Something that like it doesn't trigger you, it glimmers you. So when she said that, I was like, that's perfect. We will do that name. Thank you for connecting it with the younger audience. And so it's called Glimmer. We're just taking kind of signups for the waitlist for the beta. So it's very early, but I'm very excited about how that's a perfect way where AI can come in and do something that can seem quite small, but then you stop the snowball from snowballing. It has a huge effect. Imagine if we could see in a few years that the government spends a lot less on fixing children's cavities because women got this like little extra support before giving birth, so they had easier births and their kids didn't get mineralized teeth. And we don't know, like small things, we're all connected in that whole shebang. So for me, that's super interesting. And I'm excited.
Sounds incredible. So before we go, I want to ask you, you mentioned you are an angel investor as well, and obviously an investor in a different shape with Daya. But what would you say are the 3 key tips when angel investing in startups that you would share with our listeners?
Yeah, I can just look into my own investments and say that the best investments I've ever made were with a very ambitious woman who really understands the problem. So none of them really had a solution, even when I invested. Like, they were very committed to a problem, and they were committed to a problem in a sense where if the solution they pitched to me then wouldn't work, I know that they would find another one, because they're not committed to this specific company or this specific tech product or whatever. They're committed to solving this issue. They're not going to stop until they do that in whatever form that takes, because as a startup, it's all about pivoting, blah, blah, blah. And you might be tricked into thinking that it's better if you really understand the product. And some people might disagree with me, but for me, it's like, if you really understand the problem, you're committed to solving the problem, not committed to the product or the specific solution. Because if you're committed to the product or specific solution, it's going to be really hard for those type of founders to pivot when their data is telling them something else, or they're getting the validation doesn't match their expectations. Whilst if you're committed to the problem, you're just going to do whatever you can to fix the problem, regardless if it's this technology or something completely different. Then I would say to not be afraid to go in super early. I think that's everything a startup doesn't have yet is a discount on the valuation. So people are like looking in, and then you're like looking at all the things that are missing and all the things that are unclear, and you're just trying to find kind of the risks and the faults. And you're like, all the risks and the faults you're finding are just a discount on the valuation. If they had all those things, it would be too expensive for you to invest. Think of the things that are missing as an opportunity for you to invest, or even the reason why you are able to invest. And they're not scary things, they're good things. And thirdly, I would say be there for the founders and not the company. I can make mistakes here because there have been some boards where I've actually left because I was like, I'm not going to be able to do what's best for the company, because if that doesn't correlate with what's best for the founders, I'm going to go with the founders. That's really good at early stage, but then it's okay, I need to step back because now we need people on the board that are only looking out for the company, not for the founders. But if you're working in early stage, I think founders need someone on their side. As you scale, I would see myself as a friend first to the founders, and that might make me a very bad investor in late stage, but it makes me an excellent investor in early stage. And when I step down from the board and now I'm passive, they can still come to me and complain about the other investors. and they need that, because founder mental health, fundraising is hard, running a startup is hard. They need someone where they feel that complete emotional trust with. And if you're going to be an early stage investor, I think you should be that person. You should be the one that makes sure that their head is above water when the other later stage investors are looking out for the company and not for the founder.
And that's such a great differentiation between not only looking at different sectors, but also what stage you're investing in, because different skill set is needed for those as well.
There's early and fun space to be early, like ridiculously early. That's where you should be. That's the fun part.
Yeah. Wonderful. Malin, I think that we will call it a wrap here. Thank you so much for joining on the podcast and for the wonderful insights into Femtech, venture studios, and all the important topics around women's health that you shared with us.
Thank you. This is so much fun. I'm always happy to talk about Daya.
And thank you all for listening to the Investing in Other Stories podcast. If you enjoyed this content, please take a moment to subscribe to and rate the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me, Margarita Tr, on LinkedIn, or at Finance Latte on Instagram. And you can follow Malin Frithiofsson and Daya on LinkedIn. Cheers and see you next time. The information provided on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. The opinions expressed on this podcast are as of the day of the recording and are subject to change without notice. The views and opinions of guests on this podcast are not necessarily those of Finance Latte AB or its host Margarita Tr, collectively referred to as Finance Latte. Finance Latte is not affiliated with its guests or their affiliates unless otherwise stated. Finance Latte does not guarantee the accuracy or the completeness of the data presented herein. The information on this podcast is for informational purposes only, and the information, data, analysis, and opinions it includes should not be considered investment advice or tax advice, and is therefore not an offer to buy or sell a security. Finance Latte AB is not responsible for damages or other losses resulting from or related to the information, data, analysis, or opinions in the recording. Past performance does not guarantee future results. All investments are subject to investment risk, including loss of principal. Individuals should consider their own unique needs and circumstances and objectives before making investment decisions. Please consult with a tax or financial advisor for advice specific to your individual circumstances.